Back at the Cannes Yachting Festival in September this year, Prestige launched its first ever powercat, the M48, and just a month later here in Barcelona, it's on the water and ready for the press to give it its first sea trials. 19 knots feels almost exactly like 6. Perfectly comfortable, it's perfectly stable. Now, as I say, this is the M48. This is the first of the M-line craft from Prestige. It will be joined in the near future, I'm told, by a 60-footer, the M60, and something in between, around about the 54-foot mark. But as I say, this is the M48. It's just under 49 feet, and the beam on it is just under 20 feet. Now, that's huge by monohull standards, not such a vast beam by traditional cat standards, but of course this is not, as they're at pains to stress, this is not a sailing cat that's been adapted for engines. This is a power-driven vessel from the ground up, so it's slightly narrower, slightly loftier, and we're told that it combines the living spaces of perhaps the Prestige 590 with a price comparable to the Prestige 520 and running efficiency pretty much in line with a 40-footer. So I'm really keen to get on board this one and take a closer look. Now, of course, with a cat like this, the natural place to start is at the aft end. And what an aft end it is. Prestige has really gone to town to make the very most of that 20-foot beam, and they've done that by integrating a 3-part aft platform. Now, the central section you see here, that can handle a 3.2 metre tender, anything up to around about 250 kilos, so that brings all sorts of boats into play. And that can obviously, on those chocks, it can drop your tender down into the water, but it also can elevate it above the level of the water when you're underway to keep it dry, to keep it out of harm's way, particularly when the weather's a bit iffy and you've got a long passage to get done. But if you want to, you can elevate it even further, as you can see from these little guides on the side, so that it sits just below the level of this cockpit. And then you remove these little barriers, slide this central bit of furniture out the way, and what you have in an instant, well I say an instant, in about 20 seconds, is a very substantial cockpit extension. So you can extend the adults party out here, have plenty of fun, and because it's in 3 parts, you retain proper swim platforms on both sides, with ladders and grabbing points and unencumbered steps. So that's a really, really neat touch. Now that's operated from the buttons inside this starboard locker, up and down for the platform, and also up and down for the storage section. And that storage section is contained rather neatly in the centre there. Now that goes back about 2.7 metres, so that's an absolutely enormous space. It houses things like the generator and the batteries, but there are also, as standard, nice canvas partitions, so you can load all your water sports toys in there and they won't clatter into your mechanical equipment. And if you do have a tender loaded onto this aft platform, it's good to see, if I step up into this cockpit, that we have an alternative means of accessing that space. So you're not locked out of it simply because you happen to be carrying a tender. If I come down in here, you can see it's pretty enormous. There's the generator aft, there's a water tank down here, another water tank on the other side. It's a nice symmetrical layout, but of course that is the canvas that I was talking about. So that canvas is hiding that starboard water tank and giving you loads of space to stow your toys. And you could stow all sorts in here. Skis, wakeboards, kayaks, stand-up inflatables, you name it. It's a huge space. That's very impressive. Let's close that back up. There are a couple of other things in this cockpit worth mentioning too. And firstly, there's that flybridge. As you can see, it goes a long way aft, almost to the back edge of that stern bench. So it's really quite substantial in terms of the shelter it provides. And as you can see from these canvases and the zips around the periphery, this entire section can be zipped off and turned into a kind of semi-alfresco four-seasons space, if that's what you want to do with it. We also have to port the steps to that Flybridge, and you'll notice they're a very, very friendly angle. It's always tempting for designers to make these quite steep just to maximise the deck space available in the cockpit, but they haven't done that. What they've done instead is keep them nice and safe. Big steps, nice easy angle, really good grab rails, and a nice cutout that goes all the way aft, so there's no prospect whatsoever of smacking your head as you move up, which is all too common an occurrence for me on Flybridge cruises, I can tell you. So that's a nice touch, and beneath it they fitted an ice maker and a handy little spot to chuck your spare lines or your shoes, plus a little seat just on the aft edge of that saloon. And elsewhere in this cockpit, as you'll see, we've got freestanding furniture. That's an interesting choice. This particular furniture is made by an Italian company called Rado, which is very well respected for high-end gear, and the furniture feels very good indeed. Now, of course, it is anchored into place on these metal brackets with these pins down into the deck, but it does mean that you're not carrying around excess weight with huge mouldings for fixed furniture, and it also means, you know, because this is a cat and there's storage basically everywhere you look, you don't really need extra storage boxes under your seats, so that makes quite a lot of sense in its own right, and it introduces a fair bit of versatility in terms of what you can do with this deck. As for engines, this boat comes with a pair of Volvo Penta's D4 320s on V drives, and there are no options. That is what you get, and I quite like that. I mean, I've seen Prestige do that with various monohulls in the past, and it's always resulted, in my experience, in an efficient and refined and very well sorted ride, so I have no arguments with it here. If we pop down into this space, a very good question would be, well, where are the engines? And what they've done here is position them right down in the very bottoms of these deep hulls and put partitions on top, so you can use this enormous space for storage. I know I've said that a lot as I've been going around this boat, but the capacity for storage is just vast, and assuming you don't need direct access to your engines while you're on a cruise, then it'd certainly take a lot of the pressure off the rest of your storage spaces, a space of this sort of scale. If we lift that central one up, we should see an engine. There we are. There it is, the D4 320 on V drives. Now, this boat comes with a pair of 600 litre tanks, and Prestige tells me that if you're cruising at around about 16 knots, that's a very fast cruise for a 20 knot boat, but if you're cruising at 16 knots you can expect around about 250 nautical miles. If you're cruising at 8 knots you can expect about 600 nautical miles. That's obviously about 2 litres per nautical mile, which is a hell of a feat on a boat of this scale. If we make our way forward up a couple of steps onto these big wide side decks, nice substantial guardrails on the outside and little handles built into the edge of the Flybridge there, another step up that bodes very well for the accommodation down below. When we reach this foredeck, again, a couple of really interesting features. We have moulded in furniture on the leading edge there, and that's all fixed. There are no backrest mechanisms or anything like that, and then there are no hatches or windows beneath those cushions, so it's a fairly simplistic space, but these function very well actually as forward-facing seats. They really are very comfortable, and we have more of this freestanding furniture in a kind of wraparound C shape right up here at the forepeak. And I say forepeak, it's one of the bluntest forepeaks you'll ever see, because of course as a cat it carries a hell of a lot of beam a long way forward, so it provides tremendous space up here. It's a very sociable spot, and because we have quite a deep set bridge deck on this particular model, because they wanted to use the space between the holes for accommodation as well as the holes themselves, that translates into a pretty enormous anchor locker in the centre here, as you can see. Plenty of room for your chain and plenty of room for extras like covers for your cushions and so on. And there's also space up here for a lot more storage beneath the deck Or if you really fancy it, even though it's a 48 footer and a cat, so relatively easy to handle, if you really fancy it, you can use these as little crew cabins. Now it's just a single crew cabin, and it's not so much a cabin as a hole, but it's a cushioned hole, and I dare say for a proper salty sea dog that would be perfectly acceptable, although there are no hull windows and no prospect of acquiring any on this boat, so it's pretty basic. As I say, if you don't need crew, then you could just spec that instead as a storage space. But if you do have crew, then on the other side, we can crack this open. There we are. On the other side, we have a ladder leading down to a very deep set toilet there with a sink and a shower fitting, so you can use this as a wet room. And as you can see from the shape of it from up here, it really is right in the very forwardmost part, the tapered part of that starboard hull. Now, if you didn't want to use that for storage and you didn't particularly want to use crew either, then it would make a pretty serviceable space for a couple of adventurous kids. I know my kids would love it. So it's quite possible that Prestige is going to be speccing that as a crew cabin more often than not. As we make our way up onto that all-important Flybridge via these very gentle, very generous steps, banging no elbows, smacking no heads, the first thing we come to is the helm positioned a long way forward and to port. That's a two-man helm, so quite sociable, and it backs onto a very decent wet bar with an electric griddle and a fair size of sink there, plus some extra storage and the obligatory fridge, so you don't have to pop down below to the main galley to serve your guests up here. Let's close that back up. Now this helm, although it's obviously big enough for two, it's quite nice to see that Prestige has also factored in an additional bench, a forward-facing bench on the starboard side. I reckon that's big enough for 2 or 3 people actually, who want to keep the skipper company during a passage. And that backs neatly onto the aft-facing bench for that big dining station, that big sociable area on the starboard side. And that mirrors very nicely the sociable area down in the saloon. It's huge, big enough for 10 again, so that's a nice touch. What I really like from the skipper's position is the fact that that huge aperture built into the deck to accommodate those kind of low-angled steps, that enables you to see the port quarter very easily from here, which makes coming alongside manoeuvres astern a much simpler job. They've moved further aft, more of this lovely Rado freestanding furniture. At the very aft end we have a big sun pad with cushions in the centre that of course provide the C shape for that dining station, but they also provide a nice little lounging area for 3 or 4 people back here, just to put their feet up, take it easy and watch the wake disappear aft. Now on a monohull, big wide side decks like that might set the alarm bells ringing a little bit. You'd think, well, what's going to happen to the usable living space in this saloon? But of course with that 20-foot beam it's not a problem. We have a nice single level deck and big wraparound windows that kind of accentuate that sense of scale and space. And we have a relatively simplistic layout, I have to say. We've got a big galley on the starboard side aft, which is well positioned with these fold-up windows and sliding patio doors to integrate with this cockpit and serve the guests both back here and up top on that Flybridge. On the port side we have an enormous socialising area and dining station, and then we have a single helm further forward. Now that single helm is interesting. On a boat of this scale you might find it a little bit odd, but actually this boat doesn't come with a standard lower helm. You spec this if you're using the boat in Northern Europe, in places where the climate doesn't allow you to helm from the Flybridge 100% of the time. So Britain, basically. And the fact that this lower helm is so compact opens up all sorts of possibilities elsewhere on this boat. So the forward owner's cabin, that's got its own entirely private access. The starboard hull with the guest cabin down there, that's got its own private access. And there's a third a third stairwell, as you can see, on the port side that leads down to the guest cabin on the port side. So that opens up all sorts of benefits in terms of guest privacy and in terms of owner privacy. It makes it a much more usable cruising machine. Some of the detailing is pretty good too. We've got these strip lights on the ceiling, kind of recessed, just to give you that ambient kind of glow, and that looks very cool. What looks even cooler is the woodwork, the way that's machined into the side of the galley. It picks out the light really beautifully. It's very classy indeed. On the port side, these units, although they look freestanding, and given the freestanding furniture elsewhere, you'd be forgiven for thinking that they were, but actually they look that way because the cushions come out a little further than the base. So this would be ideal for some more recessed LEDs to give a glow, a sense that it's floating, so hopefully they'll introduce that. Further forward on the starboard side, we've got quite a classic Prestige touch. Up these steps we have the side door. Now it's quite low, it's actually only about 4 feet, which sounds like a bit of a difficulty really for most people, but actually I've been in and out of there all day and it's not a problem at all. And more to the point, we've seen that kind of feature in action on some of Prestige's monohulls and it works absolutely fine, so that's not a problem at all. And up here at the lower helm, this is the point where the flybridge up above begins. So this section here is not quite big enough for a proper sunroof, so in place of that, what Prestige has done is introduce a couple of hatches, one to starboard, one to port. And they've hinged it at the aft end, so that when you open it up underway, it naturally scoops fresh air down onto this lower helm position. One of the key decisions that any cat design has to make, though, is what to do with the accommodation. Traditionally, of course, it would be housed in each of the hulls with nothing in between. But here, on the Prestige M48, as I step forward down these steps, as you can see, they've dropped that bridge deck so they can make full use of the space between those hulls. So we've got a big central bed right there. We also have some nice natural light through those leather slot windows that open out onto that foredeck. And we also have a pair of hatches up above in the sunbathing zone. If we look to port, we'll see that it extends right across into the tapering forward edge of those hulls. So we've got a nice lounge to port there, a kind of chaise longue. Some people choose to spec that actually as storage, but there's so much storage elsewhere on this boat, it seems like a slightly peculiar choice. And when you're sitting down or lying down in the bed, that big long raked window is at the perfect height to see the horizon, which is a nice touch. On the other side, the starboard side, we have a dressing table. That's a nice big section for books and bits and bobs, and a couple of switches for your lights, plus the stereo remote down here and a couple of charging points, ideally positioned just down by the bed. I see we have some of that recessed lighting there, that ambient lighting that makes the bed appear like it's floating, and that's a nice touch, so hopefully we will see that applied up in the saloon too in the not too distant future. What I really like about this cabin is not the sleeping space exactly, as the fact that they've positioned the more prosaic functional areas down a couple of steps and further aft, and then separated them, one to starboard and one to port. So in the starboard section we have a toilet and a mirror. We have a little hatch above and an opening porthole, plus a good size sink. There's lots of space in here, lots of space indeed. And on the port side, if we take you over there, there's the shower. Again, we've got another sink and a mirror, and a really good size shower with excellent headroom. It feels quite indulgent actually. I mean, this cabin is probably 5 metres wide. I mean, obviously it doesn't inherit the full scale of that 20-foot beam because the cat tapers towards the bows, but it is huge As for storage, that's again very well taken care of. We have a nice big deep pull-out drawer beneath that port settee. We also have more beneath the bed itself of an equal size on both sides. If I spin myself around, taking care to have another look at this lovely wooden detailing at the bed head, you'll see that on either side of the door we have a big storage unit. Now on the port side, the top part of that has a little recess which is perfect for the television. On the starboard side, the idea from Prestige was to, well, it wasn't just economy of manufacture, that wasn't the idea apparently, not just efficiency by mimicking one with the other. The idea was that you could fit art in here, but nobody, they say, seems to have understood that, so they feel like they need to whack some art in there to illustrate how lovely that can look, art on one side and TV on the other. But anyway, what you definitely get is a good space underneath for your shirts and your trousers, all your hanging gear, and that's mimicked exactly on the other side. Now let's make our way aft and take a look at those two guest cabins. Back up the steps into the saloon, and you'll see that the first steps we come to are on the starboard side between the helm and the galley, so we'll pop down there. And because they're forward steps, of course, we turn right and face aft. And there we have it. There's a double bed, a double cabin. I say double cabin, of course, because we have runners here, as you can see just down there. You can split this one into a pair of singles. And it also has its own ensuite facilities with a toilet and sink. Excellent headroom, perhaps 7 feet there. And if we look down here at the separate shower compartment, you'll see that we've got a slight angle factored into that door, and that enables a better arc of travel for the door to access the toilet. So that's neatly considered. They thought very hard about how to really maximise use of space on this boat, and it definitely pays dividends. And we head back into the cabin itself. You'll see there's good space on either side, but what you'll also notice is the fact that the bed is not fore and aft, it's transverse. And the reason for that is this big window. They've given the guests some tremendous views. I mean, okay, at the moment, what we basically see is a Daihatsu, which is not perhaps living the dream, but imagine that's a gorgeous scenery out there from bed level. If I move myself further back, you get absolutely lovely views. And you also get sufficient headroom above here that you can prop yourself up in bed for a nice read without banging your head. There's a good clearance above me, so it's a very comfortable spot, and it's really nice to be facing outward and be lavish with that view from your bed. That's another thoughtful touch. And happily, they've done much the same in the other hull. If we pop over to the port side, head aft a little bit, and down we go. Now, the one crucial difference here, as you can probably already tell, is the fact that rather than gluing the cabin and the heads compartment together as an authentic ensuite, the cabin's on one side and the heads compartment is on the other. So, of course, this functions as your day heads, and it pretty much mirrors the compartment on the other side. And that's a very good thing indeed. It's within easy reach of the people in the cockpit and up in the saloon and at the galley, so that's ideal. And as you can see in here, this particular cabin, though it does mimic the other, is currently rigged as a twin rather than a double. So they've made use of those sliders and separated those beds. I've checked the lower helm, we've had a little drive, and actually this is pretty much as refined as I expected it to be. I quite like the fact that Prestige comes up with a specific rig in terms of the engines that it wants to spec, because it doesn't enable precocious customers to say, well, I would prefer these engines, I would prefer those engines. It's a boat built around a couple of engines, so it works. In my experience, the monohulls have always benefited from that approach, in that they've been efficient, they've been refined, they've felt well sorted, their trim angles are good. So stepping downstairs, even though we're not really using the lower helm at the moment, the refinement was very good. Round about sort of 12 to 16 knots, I was seeing decibel figures of around about 67, which is whisper quiet. I mean, it's brilliant for a long-term cruise. We obviously won't get those kinds of readings up here because it's windy, we're exposed. But let's sit here at the helm, give her a little bit of throttle and see how she goes. Now, we're not expecting, of course, planing figures. This is a displacement cat. What we're expecting here is stability, we're expecting efficiency, and we're expecting refinement. And as we get up and underway, I say up and underway, that's a coin of phrase I tend to use when we're talking about planing monohulls. There's no hump to get over here, we simply accelerate. We've tested a couple of the figures that we discussed with Prestige earlier in the day, and it's true, at 8 knots we are seeing about 16 litres per hour disappearing from these fuel tanks, which of course is 2 litres per nautical mile as promised. And when you've got a 1200 litre fuel tank, or rather twin 600 litre fuel tanks, that gives you a tremendous usable range at that kind of speed. When we double that to around about 16 knots, that 2 litres per nautical mile goes up to about 6 litres per nautical mile. But of course this is a very, very substantial boat. 49 feet in length, 20-foot beam, all that saloon space, all those outdoor recreation spaces, and of course that lowered bridge deck between the hulls that enables them to increase the volume for the accommodation, which on many cats of course is a kind of endemic flaw. And that's the kind of cat this is. This is not a cat for rough seas and very long distance adventurous passages. By dropping that bridge deck in rough seas, you tend to get the odd impact where those lower mouldings will make an impact with the seas and they will sort of arrest your progress a little bit, slightly compromise your comfort and your running efficiency. With Prestige, it's supposed to be a home away from a home. So they've chosen to make that compromise, chosen to deepen that bridge deck because it gives you all those other good things. And in conditions like today off Barcelona, we got a bit of a breeze running, but we're probably only seeing 1 or 2 foot swells rolling about. Not once have I felt those lower mouldings between the hulls interact with the sea state in any way whatsoever. So it's perfectly comfortable, it's perfectly stable. Now if we just get her up to full pace on this boat incidentally is around about 19 to 20 knots. And it's quite a peculiar experience because of course 19 knots feels almost exactly like 6. The running attitude doesn't change at all, the noise barely changes at all. All that does change is you burn a little more fuel to get where you're going, and that's the choice you make. But in all regards, it's perfectly reasonable to look at that lower helm position and say, yeah, that needs a bit of development, that needs a bit of work. But as you sit up here in the upper helm position, ergonomically it's absolutely bang on. Everything falls very much to hand, and while arguably it's not necessarily required on a cat with the props so far apart, we also have the benefit of bow thruster and joystick control. So in terms of low speed manoeuvring when you get back to the pontoon, it absolutely couldn't be easier. And there we have it. That's the story of the Prestige M48. It's voluminous, it's full of wonderful opportunities to sleep and to eat and to socialise, to find a quiet corner tucked away, to change your scenery. And in terms of its driving performance, it's precisely as you would expect. I mean, it's not going to set your world on fire, it's not a performance machine, it's not a long distance offshore machine. It's a comfortable, refined home from home, and it drives very much that way. Okay, so I've got a quick confession to make. I mentioned that this boat will be followed by a 60-footer and then probably something between these two, around about the 54-foot mark. That, it turns out, is nothing but hearsay. I've learned today directly from Irwin that it's going to be a 68-footer and it's going to be introduced in 2023, probably at the Cannes Yachting Festival. It's reasonable then to assume that after that, they're going to fill that gap between the 48 and the 68 with something around about 58, I would have thought. That is guesswork, but the 68 is definitely going to happen. Either way, what we have here in the form of the M48, in the form of Prestige's first foray into powercats, is really impressive. And it's particularly impressive for novice boaters, for people just getting into boating, because it's so easy to drive, you really cannot get it wrong. It's very, very easy to park. And in terms of the spatial management, the intelligence of the way that the space flows on this main deck, and in particular down below, it's absolutely impeccable. It's such an easy boat to enjoy. It's not as great to drive as various monohulls at this kind of length, of course. It's not as sexy to look at as various monohulls in this kind of length. But when you get to your destination, when you arrive at your mooring, when you anchor up, you just can't get a monohull that's going to give you anything like as impressive a party platform as this 48-footer will. Now, the price for this boat, it starts around about 1.2 million euros plus tax, and in this configuration, the test boat we see here, 1.4 million plus tax. That is about 3% more than the Prestige 520. But as I pointed out earlier, it gives you the space of Prestige's 590 alongside running efficiency akin to perhaps a 40-foot monohull. And for a lot of recreational boaters, that is going to be a combination of talents too good to miss.